My name is Aubrey Archer, and I learned a long time ago that silence can be armor. The night my sister announced her engagement, the backyard looked like a catalog spread, string lights drawn tight as a smile, linen napkins folded into swans, jazz floating from speakers you couldn't see. I stood at the patio doors with a glass of water I didn't want, watching my mother rehearse her warmth on the arriving guests. Someone laughed about traffic. Someone else admired the ring. No one looked at me long enough to ask a real question. "Aubrey, you made it," my mother said, already turning away as if I were a box she'd checked. My sister's eyes flicked down my black dress like a scanner searching for a price tag. "You've always had such simple taste," she said, sweet as frosting and just as empty. A server slid past with the first course. Cutlery chimed. An uncle called across the table. "Still driving that old sedan?" Laughter landed lightly, the kind that leaves bruises later. I took a sip and let it go where all the others had gone, into the part of me that stopped expecting softness from people who loved the idea of family more than the work of it. Then her fiancé, a polite man with good posture, leaned forward as if asking the time. "Aubrey," he said, careful, curious. "This is going to sound random, but do you know anything about an Archer insignia on a jet I saw last week in Antigua?" The table stilled. Forks hovered. I set my glass down and looked at him. "Why?" I asked, and let the question settle like a coin at the bottom of a well. The place cards were calligraphed in ink that bled slightly at the curves, my name wedged between a second cousin who sold mortgages and an aunt who collected stories she shouldn't repeat. By the time I took my seat, the servers were already moving in a practiced ballet, salads first, then wine, then the little speech my mother insisted on giving before the main course. She tapped her glass with a fork, and everyone performed attention the way people stand for an anthem they don't think about. "Family," she began, and the word floated like a centerpiece no one could see around. She talked about love and milestones and how proud she was that we could gather. She didn't look at me when she said it. Pride, in our house, had always been directional. I unfolded my napkin and laid it across my lap, the linen heavy as a hand. Sophie tilted her face toward the lights so the diamond could catch their breath. "Isn't it perfect?" she asked the table. Not me. There were appreciative sounds, the kind you make in museums when you don't want to seem uneducated. The first bite of salad tasted like citrus and effort. My second cousin asked the woman beside him whether parking had been a nightmare. My aunt leaned over my shoulder, perfume like peonies and powder. "You're glowing," she said, meaning I looked tired. "Work keeping you busy?" Her tone suggested it shouldn't be. "It keeps the lights on," I said. "Practical." She smiled, as if I'd confirmed a rumor. Across from me, my uncle settled into his favorite role, good-natured heckler. "Aubrey, how many miles on that car now?" He grinned at the table, inviting a chorus. "You and that little engine that could—" "Enough to get here," I said. The server poured Chardonnay into glasses that weren't mine. I kept my water. It felt like a choice, even if no one noticed. Sophie dabbed at the corner of her mouth with a napkin she hadn't used. "She's always been like this," she told her fiancé, performing intimacy for the room, so grounded, no pressure to impress. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It rarely did when she talked to me. I could have told the story the way they preferred it. Aubrey, the stubborn minimalist, the one who left and came back with a suitcase that never grew heavier. But stories, like houses, belong to whoever holds the keys, and I'd learned to keep mine in a pocket no one asked about. The mains arrived, steak edges glossed with butter, a whole roasted fish for the show of it. My mother complimented the chef loudly enough that the chef's assistant nodded from the shadows. The conversation shifted to honeymoons and villas, to weather in places that photograph well. Someone said St. John. Someone else said St. Croix. Sophie's fiancé, Liam, listened more than he spoke. A habit that made people assume things about him that might not be true. When he finally turned toward me, it wasn't with the spotlight hunger I knew so well from this family. It was curiosity, plain and unadorned. "Aubrey," he said, "have you ever spent time in Antigua?" My fork paused over the fish. "Once," I said, and returned it to the plate. He nodded slowly, like he was fitting a puzzle piece without forcing it. I asked because I saw an Archer insignia on a G600 there last week. The concierge mentioned Seattle. It stuck with me. He was apologizing with his eyebrows for intruding, but he didn't look away. The table, sensitive to shifts in air pressure, went quiet in that way. People mistake for politeness. My mother's smile tightened at the corners. My uncle sipped too fast. Sophie's fingers landed on the stem of her glass like landing gear. "It's a common name," my aunt offered, too quickly. "Archer. So many Archers. Fewer on the side of Jets," Liam said, soft. I set my fork down and folded my hands. The ring lights winked in the spoons. "What made you ask?" I said, and let him hear that I wasn't offended. He shrugged, a small, honest motion. Details stick. Sophie's voice dipped, sugar melting. "Liam, don't be ridiculous." He didn't answer her. He held my gaze, and in the space between us I felt the weight of all the times I hadn't corrected anyone. It wasn't shame. It was muscle memory. My mother cleared her throat. "Dessert is a lemon tart," she announced to no one in particular, summoning a future where this moment had already passed. "Sounds lovely," I said, and turned my glass a quarter inch, the condensation tracing a new circle on the linen. Liam's question hung in the air like a photograph you couldn't prove wasn't edited. No one reached for it. Across the lawn, the lights hummed. In the kitchen, a pan clanged and a voice said sorry in a way that meant it. I felt the table waiting for me to perform the version of myself they knew, the deflection, the small joke, the ease they could call humility. Instead, I let the moment breathe. "Aubrey." My uncle tried again, aiming for casual. "You know what those things cost?" He whistled softly, as if we were admiring thunder from a porch. "Enough," I said, and smiled like a closed door. Sophie laughed too brightly. "She's teasing you." "I don't think she is," Liam said. The lemon tart arrived with powdered sugar, sifted like new snow. The server set one in front of me last, polite choreography that felt like a verdict. I lifted my fork and didn't taste a thing. When I looked up, my mother was studying me the way people examine a painting after someone else points out a detail they missed. Her voice, when it came, was careful. "We can talk later," she said, as if later were a room she still owned. "Maybe," I said, and the word landed softly but didn't move. The small clatter of plates resumed. Conversations restarted at slightly higher volumes, a trick to push discomfort to the edges. Liam hadn't touched his tart. He was still looking at me, waiting for an answer I hadn't decided to give. I wasn't there to win a scene. I was there to decide which story I refused to tell. Liam didn't push, and that was somehow worse. I could feel the weight of what he'd said lingering between the candles and the centerpieces, threading itself into the places my family preferred to keep dark. No one asked me about the Archer insignia again, not directly. But their glances spoke in dialects I knew by heart, curiosity edged with suspicion, the quick dart of eyes from one face to another to gauge who might know more. I cut my fish into small, deliberate bites, chewing slower than the conversation moved. Sophie filled the gaps, talking about the custom invitations, the tasting menu, the boutique in Charleston where she found her dress. She spoke to him, to them, to herself. as if the right adjectives could smooth over whatever ripple his question had caused. When dessert plates were half finished, my aunt leaned toward me again. "So, where are you living these days? Aubrey?" She said it too loudly, like she wanted the whole table to hear. "Seattle," I said, the word flat as a playing card. "Still in that apartment?" My mother's voice floated from the far end. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one, but because I knew the truth wouldn't land the way she thought it should. The building I lived in now had its own name, its own doorman, a view of the water that could make a prayer out of silence. None of that would translate here. The clink of forks filled the pause. My cousin's husband cleared his throat, muttered something about the wine pairing, and the conversation shifted again, thin ice creaking under too many feet. I let my eyes drift across the table, tracing the edges of faces that had been constants in my life, but never anchors. I'd sat across from these same expressions at holidays and graduations, at funerals and reunions, each time reminded that the version of me they recognized was the one that fit their story best. It wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was habit. Sometimes it was convenience. Sometimes it was the fact that people only have room for the truth if it doesn't crowd their own. Liam caught my gaze from 2 seats down, held it for a beat too long. There was no challenge there, no pity either, just a quiet recognition. The way you'd look at a stranger whose language you happen to speak in a country that doesn't. I remembered being 15, sitting at another long table in another too-perfect backyard, listening to these same voices debate whether I'd settle somewhere close or wander too far to visit. Back then, the thought of escape felt like treason. Now, it felt like oxygen. The server cleared my plate and offered coffee. I said yes, though it would keep me awake. Sophie declined, waving a manicured hand, already half-turned toward a photographer she'd hired for candids. From the corner of my eye, I watched Liam lean toward her, murmur something that made her smile, though her shoulders stayed tight. Then he looked past her, straight at me again. "What kind of work do you do, Aubrey?" he asked, this time without the cushioning of small talk. It was a simple question, one any polite guest might ask, but in this house, at this table, it was loaded. For years, my family had treated my job like a placeholder, something to keep me busy until I came to my senses, married well, or ran out of stubbornness. I set my coffee cup down carefully. "Logistics," I said. "That's vague," Sophie interjected with a light laugh, like she was doing me a favor. "It covers a lot," I said, not looking at her. Liam tilted his head. "International?" "Yes." "And successful?" I smiled without showing teeth. "Enough to keep the lights on." He smiled back, and for a moment the table noise faded. It wasn't my job to correct their narratives. I'd spent too long thinking I could buy my way into their good graces with generosity, helping with tuition, picking up dinner checks, sending gifts I never saw opened. Every attempt had been reframed as a transaction, proof that I was trying too hard, proof that I didn't belong without paying rent on my place in the family. That debt had been canceled the day I stopped asking for a seat. Sophie reached for her glass again, the diamond catching another line of light. "Well," she said, her tone a closing door, "we're just glad you could make it tonight." I nodded once, a gesture that could be gratitude if you didn't look too closely. The rest of the evening unfolded like a script, compliments for the chef, toasts to the couple, a round of polite applause when Sophie's college roommate shared a story about their first apartment. I kept my face neutral, my laughter quiet, my hands still. When the check came, though I knew it wouldn't be handed to me, Liam's gaze flicked to mine again. There was something in his expression I couldn't name. Respect? Maybe? Or the start of a suspicion he'd eventually confirm. By the time people began gathering their things, the air had cooled. Conversations moved toward the doorway. Jackets were retrieved. Hugs were exchanged with the precision of people fulfilling a quota. I stayed seated until the last possible moment, watching the lights shift in the glasses as the servers cleared the table. "Good night, Aubrey," my mother said, already turning toward the kitchen. "Night," I replied. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain on brick. I walked to my car, yes, the old one, my heels clicking in a rhythm that felt steady, deliberate. From the driveway, I could still see the glow of the backyard through the hedges. Figures moved inside the light, their voices carrying in fragments I didn't need to piece together. I unlocked the car, slid in, and closed the door. The cabin was quiet, the way I liked it. I started the engine and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, letting the warmth build. Somewhere behind me, laughter rose and broke apart like glass. I didn't turn to look. The rain had started by the time I reached the main road, soft enough to bead on the windshield before the wipers smeared it into gray. I drove without music, letting the low hum of the engine and the patter of water fill the space where other people might replay conversations. There was nothing to replay tonight. No surprises, no warm reconnections. Just the same choreography my family and I had perfected years ago. Smiles like place settings, glances sharp enough to cut but never quite draw blood. They thought my silence came from embarrassment, that if I had more to brag about, I'd be louder. The truth was, I'd already learned what happened when I offered them the real story. They'd either try to shrink it until it fit their comfort, or they'd take it apart to see if it was worth less than it looked. When I left home at 22, I told them it was for a job. It wasn't a lie, exactly. But it wasn't the whole truth either. The job was barely more than a paycheck, a customer support role in a cramped warehouse office where the heat cut out in winter and the fluorescent lights made your skin look like bad news. What I didn't tell them was that I'd brought an idea with me, a half-finished program on an old laptop, lines of code written between shifts at a campus cafe, meant to help independent couriers track and optimize their routes. It was simple, unpolished, and no one was asking for it. But I believed in it the way some people believe in lottery tickets. You just need the one. For the first year. I lived in the basement of a house owned by a woman who collected antique dolls and cooked in bulk once a month. My room had no windows. The rent was cheap, the air stale, and I could hear the pipes groan like old men in the walls. Nights were for coding, mornings for coffee reheated twice, afternoons for the job that paid for both. I learned quickly that ambition doesn't announce itself. It grows in the corners where no one's looking, in the hours no one else will claim. I didn't post about it. I didn't mention it in holiday calls home. When Sophie asked how I was, I said busy and left it at that. 2.5 years in, I almost quit. The program was functional but clunky. The kind of thing you could get working if you knew where to kick it, but not something you could hand to a stranger with confidence. Then an email came from a logistics firm in Singapore. They'd stumbled across my tool through a courier who'd found it online and adapted it for their own use. They wanted to talk about scaling. Scaling. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like a password I hadn't earned yet. The deal didn't happen overnight. It took months of late-night calls across time zones, contracts I read 3 times each, and more caffeine than my body was built to process. But by the end of the 3rd year, I had a team. By the 5th, we had offices. And in the 7th, we had an acquisition offer that came with more zeros than I'd ever seen outside of a spreadsheet. When the papers were signed, I didn't celebrate with champagne or call my family. I went for a walk, bought myself a sandwich from a corner deli I liked, took the long way home. I kept the same car, the same plain phone case, The same habit of paying with cash at coffee shops. It wasn't about hiding. It was about peace. Because I knew what would happen if I told them. The questions wouldn't be about the work, or the risk, or the years I'd spent holding it together with duct tape and hope. They'd be about the number. The number would become the story, and the story would become theirs to edit. So I built another company, quieter, more deliberate, something sustainable, something that didn't need my name in headlines. I traveled when I wanted, often alone. I stayed in places where no one cared who I was as long as I paid the bill. I learned to listen for the absence of noise. But family has a way of mistaking your boundaries for walls meant to be kicked down. They'd send the occasional text. "Did you get Sophie's wedding invite? Will you be in town for Thanksgiving?" As if we were still speaking the same language. And when I didn't volunteer details, they filled in the blanks themselves, struggling, lonely, too proud to admit she made a mistake leaving. It was easier to let them believe it. I turned onto my street, the rain heavier now, blurring the streetlights into pale halos. The building loomed ahead, its glass facade catching what was left of the city's glow. I parked underground, rode the elevator up without seeing anyone, and let myself into the apartment. Inside. It was quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator. I toed off my heels, left them by the door, and crossed to the windows. The water was black and restless under the lights, fairies moving like silent chess pieces. I thought about Liam's question. Not just the words, but the tone, like he'd already guessed the answer and only wanted to see if I'd confirm it. He wasn't like the rest of them. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it breathe. Some people can't handle a pause. They need to close it with noise, to reassure themselves the world is still turning. But pauses have been my currency for years. You can learn a lot about a person by what they do when you don't give them the line they expect. I watched the rain streak down the glass until my reflection blurred. In 2 weeks, Sophie's wedding would take place in the same backyard, under the same lights. I'd already RSVP'd yes, not because I wanted to be there, but because sometimes you don't have to chase a moment for it to find you. The week before the wedding, an envelope arrived, thick, pearled, the kind that comes from a printer you have to book in advance. Inside was a schedule, not just for the ceremony, but for the photos, the speeches, even the times when guests were encouraged to mingle. I read it over coffee and set it aside. Sophie had always loved a script. The morning of, the city was glazed with heat. I chose a dress the color of midnight, cut clean, no shimmer. It slid on like a sentence without adjectives. I tied my hair back, a small rebellion against the pageantry, and slipped on shoes that wouldn't catch in grass. By the time I reached my parents' house, the same house I'd left without ceremony over a decade ago, cars lined the street. The backyard was a scene from a magazine, white folding chairs arched toward an altar draped in flowers that looked too delicate for the air. Caterers moved like choreography, trays balanced in hands that didn't shake. A string quartet tested their bows. I stayed at the edge of the lawn, out of the photographs. Sophie's friends glided past in silk, their laughter pitched high enough to skip across the surface of the day without sinking. My mother, in pale gold, stood near the refreshment table, smiling with the focus of someone holding a pose. No one asked where I'd been. They never did. The fewer specifics, the easier it was to keep me in the role they'd assigned. The ceremony was brief. Liam stood tall, his voice steady when he promised things people rarely keep in full. Sophie looked radiant in the way that comes from being the axis around which a day turns. When the officiant pronounced them married, applause scattered across the lawn like thrown rice. Glasses were raised, cameras lifted. The quartet launched into something romantic and safe. I drifted toward the reception tent. White canopy, gold cutlery, candles and glass cylinders lining the tables. My name was printed on heavy cardstock and set near the back. I didn't mind. From here, I could see everything without being in anyone's way. Dinner unfolded like clockwork. Salad, entree, wine refilled before you realized your glass was light. Speeches began. Friends telling stories about shared apartments, family recounting vacations that had apparently been flawless. I kept my eyes on the tablecloth, tracing the weave with my fingertips. It was easier than pretending to laugh in the right places. Then, in the lull between toasts, Liam's uncle, a man with a handshake like wet rope, took the microphone. "We're just so thrilled to welcome Sophie into the family," he said. "And of course, all of you who've traveled to be here, even those who flew in from far-off islands." It was meant as a joke, a nod to the honeymoon they'd take next week. But Liam, seated beside Sophie, looked down the table toward me. "You know," he said, his voice carrying without effort, "I saw an Archer insignia on a G600 when we were in Antigua for the venue scout. Concierge said the owner was based in Seattle." The tent quieted, the kind of hush that isn't requested but obeyed. My fork was still in my hand. I set it down. "That's right," I said, my voice even. A few heads turned so quickly I could hear the air move. My mother's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on the stem of her glass. Sophie blinked at Liam, then at me, as if trying to place me in a different scene. Liam didn't look away. "Beautiful plane," he said. "Impressive deal you closed with Eastern Freight last year, too." I didn't confirm or deny. The words hung there, sharp enough without my help. Someone at the next table whispered, too loudly, "She has a jet?" I reached for my water, took a slow sip. "I have an early flight tomorrow," I said, almost to myself. Sophie's laugh came brittle. "She's joking," she told the table, but her eyes didn't match the tone. I stood, folding my napkin into a small, precise square. "Excuse me," I said. No one moved to stop me. I walked the length of the tent, past the flowers and the candles and the stairs. The air outside was cooler, cleaner. At the edge of the lawn, I looked back once. Through the opening of the tent, I could see Sophie leaning toward Liam, her hands moving as she spoke. His expression didn't change. I kept walking. Past the parked cars, down the quiet street. My own car waited where I'd left it, unremarkable enough to disappear into any row. The engine turned over on the first try. I pulled away without glancing in the mirror. Some moments don't need witnesses. They just need to happen. The street lamps washed the pavement in pale amber, the kind of light that flattens everything into shadow and reflection. I drove with the windows down, letting the late summer air push the scent of cut grass and candle smoke out of my skin. In the rear view, the tent's glow shrank until it was just a blur against the dark, like a lantern someone forgot to extinguish. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty either. Mostly, I felt the same as I had all evening, steady, deliberate, the way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy long enough that you forget it's there. The truth about the plane, about my work, about the life I'd built. None of it was a weapon I'd ever intended to use. But sometimes the truth has its own agenda. I stopped at a red light and caught my reflection in the side window. Calm, hair still neat, no trace of the girl who used to flinch when her name came up at the dinner table. They had spent years crafting their version of me, the stubborn one, the difficult one, the one who left because she couldn't measure up. That version fit nicely in their narrative. It let them hold Sophie up as the gold standard without ever wondering what the comparison cost me. It's easier to dismiss someone when you don't see the work, when you don't watch the nights stretch into mornings, when you don't smell the burnt coffee, when you don't hear the sound of failure hitting the floor for the third, the fifth, the 10th time. I eased through the intersection when the light turned green, the city thinning around me until the streets grew quiet. I remembered a Thanksgiving years ago, before I'd left for good. Sophie had just landed an internship at a boutique PR firm, and my father made a toast to her bright future. Someone, maybe an aunt, asked about me. He smiled, raised his glass again, and said, "Aubrey's always been independent." It was meant to be a compliment, but it landed like a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to keep reading. That was the year I stopped trying to explain myself. When I reached my building, the garage door opened with a low groan. I pulled into my space, the tires whispering over concrete, and killed the engine. The sudden quiet was almost a relief. Upstairs, the apartment welcomed me with its own stillness. I set my bag on the counter, poured a glass of water, and stood by the window. Across the bay, the fairy lights moved slow and sure, indifferent to whatever dramas were playing out on shore. Somewhere at that table tonight, someone was rewriting the story already. By the time dessert plates were cleared, the plane would have turned into a gift from an investor, a fluke, an exaggeration. They'd choose the version that let them keep me in the margins, and I would let them, because the real power wasn't in convincing them. It was in knowing I didn't need to. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from an unknown number. "Sorry if that was awkward tonight. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Just respect what you've done. I didn't have to guess who it was. Thanks." I typed back. I'm used to awkward. That was just clarity. The message showed as read, and a moment later, a single thumbs up appeared. I set the phone down and thought about the word clarity. For years, I'd thought closure meant getting the last word, delivering some airtight speech that would force them to finally see me. But clarity was quieter. It didn't need applause. It didn't need anyone else in the room. On the shelf across from me, a framed photo caught the light. I was 25 in it, standing outside a warehouse with my first tiny team. None of us looked like we'd slept in days. We were holding coffee cups instead of champagne. It was the day we hit our first $1 million in annual revenue. No one in my family knew about it. I liked it that way. I drained the glass and set it in the sink. The night beyond the window was deepening, the water dark as poured ink. Somewhere out there, a plane with my name on it was ready for its next flight. I could take it tomorrow if I wanted, wake up in a city where no one had ever heard of Aubrey Archer, or the stories told about her sister. But tonight, I stayed where I was. I thought about the next 2 weeks, about the calls I needed to make, the meetings waiting on my calendar. I thought about the projects on my desk, the one I'd been working on quietly for nearly a year, a network of mentorship programs for women building companies outside the spotlight. No press releases, no photo ops, just the work, the way I preferred it. If my family ever found out, they'd find a way to make it fit the script. Aubrey trying too hard again. Aubrey chasing attention. Aubrey making everything about herself. Let them. Because I knew the truth they'd never hold in their hands. The most valuable things I had built couldn't be measured in square footage or flight hours. They lived in the people I'd hired, the ideas I'd tested, the freedom I'd carved out of nights no one else wanted, the kind of things you can't hand over at a dinner table, the kind of things they don't get to keep. The first thing I heard when I woke was the gulls. They cut through the quiet like they owned it, swooping somewhere over the marina. The second sound was the faint hum of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. I let it go to voicemail. Sunlight pooled across the hardwood in slow shapes, the air still cool from the night. I padded barefoot to the kitchen, started the kettle, and opened the balcony doors. The smell of salt and steel drifted in, carried by a breeze that felt like it had traveled a long way just to reach me. When the water boiled, I poured tea into a mug and sat at the small table by the window. The view was clean this morning. Ferries sliding across the bay, a cargo ship in the distance moving at a pace that ignored everyone else's urgency. The phone buzzed again. This time, a text preview lit the screen. "Your mother called me last night. It was from an old family friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. She's asking questions." I smiled without humor. Of course she was. I typed back, "She's always been curious when the story slips out of her hands." No reply came. I didn't expect one. I opened my laptop instead. Emails had stacked up overnight, project updates from my team, an invite to speak at a logistics conference in Singapore, a funding request from a nonprofit I'd quietly supported for years. The normal weight of my life, the kind that came without commentary from people who'd never carried it. By mid-morning, I was deep into reviewing a proposal for an expansion into South America when the phone rang again. Sophie's name on the screen this time. I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, a message arrived. "We should talk. There are rumors now. I think you should clear them up." I stared at the words. The way they assumed responsibility I hadn't claimed. Clear them up, as if the truth were a mess on her carpet. I closed the message without answering. The kettle clicked off again, though I hadn't remembered turning it back on. I poured the hot water over fresh leaves and carried the mug to my desk. Outside, clouds had begun to gather over the bay, thickening the light. There's a strange kind of peace in watching weather roll in. You can see it building, but there's nothing to do about it except be ready. Around noon, my assistant called to confirm travel plans for next week. "Antigua again?" she asked. "Yes," I said. 3 days. Keep it quiet." Of course. We went over the itinerary, meetings with port officials, site visits for the regional hub we were opening, the kind of work that required both discretion and presence. When we hung up, I found myself picturing the G600 on the tarmac, the way the sun hit its nose like a blade. Liam's voice from last night drifted back, beautiful plain. He hadn't said it for the table. He'd said it for me. The phone buzzed again. Another text, this one from my cousin. "So it's true? About the jet?" I didn't answer that one either. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had moved in completely. Rain slicked the balcony railing, the sound steady and unbroken. I closed the doors but left the curtains open, letting the gray light soften the room. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But I let it wait. Instead, I opened the drawer where I kept the only framed photo of myself that I'd ever chosen to display. It was taken on the day my first company was acquired. I'm in a plain black blazer, hair pulled back, shaking hands with a man whose name most people in my family wouldn't recognize. Behind us, the logo on the wall is slightly out of focus, as if the photographer knew the image was about people, not brands. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger. That day, no one from home had called. They hadn't known. And even if they had, they wouldn't have understood what it meant. The rain thickened. My phone stayed silent. Somewhere in the quiet, I realized I didn't mind. The life I had built didn't require their approval. It never had. What it did require was room to move, to decide, to protect what mattered from people who saw everything as currency. I set the photo back in the drawer, closed it gently, and returned to my desk. The work was still there, patient as always. By the time the clouds began to break in the late afternoon, I'd booked the Antigua trip under a name that wouldn't show up on their searches. I'd signed off on 2 contracts, declined the conference invite, and sent funding to the nonprofit. The rain had washed the view clean again. The air in Antigua felt heavier than Seattle's, as if it carried the weight of every tide that had ever reached its shores. The sun here didn't just shine. It pressed against your skin, leaving no corner of you untouched. The driver met me at the small arrivals terminal with a simple placard. No last name, no titles, just Aubrey. We didn't speak much on the 20-minute drive along the coast. I preferred it that way. The resort wasn't the kind in travel magazines, no infinity pools lined with influencers. It was built into the cliffside, half hidden by palms, the kind of place people chose when they wanted to be here without being seen. From my balcony, the water was a color that defied description, somewhere between sapphire and memory. Below, the small private dock waited, the G600 moored at the far end, gleaming in the afternoon light. I didn't go down to it right away. The jet wasn't why I was here, not exactly. The next 3 days were for meetings with port authorities, walking through the storage facility our contractors had been converting, finalizing the customs agreements for our regional hub. Logistics work, the kind no one takes photos of but everyone relies on. That first evening, I met with Ramon, the site manager. We sat at a table under the open-air terrace while the sky shifted through its final shades before night. He laid out progress reports, the final delivery schedules, the staffing requirements. I asked questions, made notes, signed off on adjustments. When we finished, he glanced toward the dock. "She's beautiful," he said. I knew he meant the plane. "She gets the work done," I said. He nodded like he understood it wasn't meant as modesty. Then he gathered his folders and left me to the night sounds, waves hitting rock, tree frogs starting their chorus. Later, I walked down to the dock alone. The boards were warm under my sandals from the day's heat. The jet's white hull caught the low light from the path lamps, the Archer insignia glinting faintly. I ran my hand along the fuselage. The metal was cool, smooth, a promise kept. I thought about the last time she'd been here, the day Liam had seen her. I imagined him on the tarmac, the concierge offering an offhand comment about the owner being based in Seattle, his curiosity, his question at the dinner table. The truth was, I didn't mind that he'd asked. What I minded was knowing that his curiosity had lit a fuse in my family's narrative, a fuse that would burn whether or not I stayed in the room to watch. The next morning started early. By 8, I was standing in the unfinished warehouse that would soon hold the main storage for our Caribbean operations. The air inside smelled of sawdust and salt. Workers moved steadily, voices rising in bursts of patois and Spanish. I liked the rhythm of it. Honest work, clear purpose. We walked the perimeter, checked the loading bays, went over the security systems. There was satisfaction in seeing the plans I'd approved months ago take shape in steel and concrete. At lunch, I sat with Ramon and the lead foreman discussing hiring timelines. They asked if I'd be attending the ribbon cutting when the hub officially opened. "Probably not," I said. "Better the team gets the credit." That night, back at the resort, I answered emails on the balcony until the battery in my laptop ran low. Somewhere in my inbox was another unread message from Sophie. I left it there. On the final morning, I allowed myself 1 hour to simply sit at the dock. No laptop, no phone. Just the sound of the water and the hum of engines from fishing boats leaving the harbor. I thought about the distance, geographic and otherwise, between here and that backyard tent, between the salt air on my skin now and the scent of hydrangeas and catered champagne that night. I thought about how my family measured success in public displays, the right ring, the right car, the right address to drop into conversation, and how mine lived in places like this, hidden in contracts, signed in quiet rooms, in the steady payroll for people whose names no one in my family would bother to remember. When the hour was up, I walked back toward the resort. The jet would be prepped for departure within the hour, its path already filed, its fuel tanks full. I didn't linger for one last look. Some things you don't need to stare at to know they're yours. The flight back to Seattle was quiet. The kind of quiet you only get at 39,000 feet when the cabin lights are dimmed and no one feels like small talk. I worked for most of it, sliding between contracts and financial reports until my eyes blurred. When we landed, the sky was the same pale gray it had been when I'd left, as if the city hadn't noticed I'd gone. By the time I reached my apartment, there were 6 new voicemails and a string of unread texts. I didn't need to listen to know the tone. My family had a cadence for these things, sharp in the beginning, then sugar-coated once they realized sharp wasn't working. The first text was from my mother. "You should have told us. It's not right that we had to hear it from someone else." The second from an aunt. "We've been fielding questions all week. Can we get on the same page?" 2 others from cousins I hadn't heard from in over a year, both some variation of, "Is it true?" I set the phone face down on the counter and poured a glass of water. The view outside was washed clean from a recent rain, the streets shining under street lamps. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn sounded, a reminder that life keeps moving whether or not you offer it commentary. The next morning, my assistant greeted me with a raised eyebrow when I walked into the office. "Your name's been bouncing around the wrong circles," she said, sliding a folder across my desk. Inside were clippings from an online gossip site that specialized in local personalities. Someone had pieced together the Archer insignia, the Eastern freight deal, and a few blurry shots of me stepping off the G600 in Antigua. I scanned them without reacting. "Pull the article into the archive," I said, "then ignore it." She hesitated. "You don't want a statement?" "No." I could feel her watching me as I opened my laptop and sank into the day's work. There were shipments delayed out of Vancouver, a customs hiccup in Belize, a proposal from a startup that wanted to partner on eco-friendly freight solutions. All of it mattered more than the noise outside these walls. By lunchtime, the phone was buzzing again. "Sophie, this time. We need to meet. People are making up their own stories. If you don't tell them, I will." I read it twice. The implication clear. Control the narrative or she would. I didn't respond. That night, I stayed late at the office. The building emptied 1 floor at a time until only the hum of the HVAC and the occasional elevator ding broke the silence. I liked it that way. The absence of voices gave the work its own rhythm. On my desk, a model of our Antigua hub sat in a glass case. I'd had it made for the team there, a reminder of what they'd built. They didn't care about who owned the jet or whose name was on the paperwork. They cared that their jobs were secure, that shipments moved on time, that the work was honest. Near midnight, I finally powered down and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the streets nearly empty. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket, but I didn't take it out. 2 blocks from home, I passed a cafe I hadn't been to in years. The windows were fogged, but I could see a few people inside, laughing over half-empty mugs. I remembered sitting at one of those corner tables in the early days, laptop open, building the skeleton of what would become my first company. No one knew my name then. No one was asking for statements or trying to fit me into a headline. I'd thought I wanted the recognition. I'd been wrong. Back at the apartment, I finally checked the phone. Sophie again. Tomorrow. Noon. The place on 5th. Please. It wasn't really a request. Sophie didn't do requests. But there was something in the please that gave me pause, like she'd slipped and let an honest note out before she could replace it with polish. I set the phone down and stared out at the water. Meeting her would mean stepping back into the noise. It would mean giving her a chance to push for the version of me she could live with. But it might also mean something I couldn't quite name yet, a moment of truth, even if it wasn't the one she intended. By the time I went to bed, I still hadn't decided. The place on 5th was one of those cafes that pretended not to care about appearances, but charged $12 for toast. Exposed brick walls, Edison bulbs. the smell of single-origin espresso hanging in the air. I arrived early, taking the table in the far corner where I could see the door without being in its path. Sophie walked in exactly at noon. She was dressed like she'd just stepped out of a curated Instagram feed, camel coat draped over her shoulders, hair in a sleek knot, sunglasses she didn't remove until she reached the table. "You look different," she said as she sat. "I am," I replied. The server came, took our orders. Sophie asked for oat milk in her latte. I ordered black coffee. The silence between the order and its arrival was long enough for her to fidget with the edge of her napkin. Finally, she leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me?" I kept my voice even. "Tell you what?" She gave a sharp laugh, like I was being deliberately obtuse. "That you own that plane, that you're—" She stopped, searching for the right word. "Successful. Really successful." "You never asked." "I shouldn't have to ask," she said. "We're sisters." I let that hang between us. Bloodlines didn't entitle anyone to my story. She pressed on. "Do you have any idea what it was like after that dinner? Liam wouldn't shut up about it. He kept asking why you didn't just say something. Mom was furious. Dad. Well, Dad started speculating about what you must have done to get it." There it was. Not curiosity. Accusation wrapped in gossip. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't relevant," I said, "and because I knew exactly what would happen if I did." Her jaw tightened. "You think so little of us." "I think exactly of you as you've shown me," I said. "When I was scraping by, no one asked how I was doing. When I started building something, you assumed I was lucky. And now that you've glimpsed the result, you're not asking. You're interrogating." The coffee arrived. I took a sip. She didn't touch hers. Sophie's tone shifted, softening just enough to make it seem like this was concern. "Aubrey, people are talking. You know how our family is. They'll fill in the blanks if you don't." "Let them," I said. "That's easy for you to say." "It's the only thing to say," I cut in. "I don't owe them a narrative. They'll spin one regardless." Her hand curled around her cup, finally lifting it, but she didn't drink. "You've changed," she murmured. I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said. "I've stopped performing." She flinched, and for a heartbeat I saw something unguarded, a flicker of recognition, maybe even regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She straightened in her seat. "So that's it? You're just going to— what? Let everyone think whatever they want? You're not going to defend yourself?" "I don't need to," I said. "The people who matter already know the truth. The rest can live with their versions." Sophie shook her head, like she couldn't fathom choosing silence over spectacle. "You've built walls so high no one can get in." "Not no one," I corrected. "Just the ones who knock to measure the square footage before deciding if it's worth stepping inside." We sat in silence then, the hum of conversation from other tables filling the space where more words might have gone. I finished my coffee, set the cup down with deliberate care. She looked at me like she wanted to say something else, maybe an apology, maybe another accusation. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. In the end, she just said, "I don't know how to talk to you anymore." "That's okay," I said, standing. "You don't have to." I left enough cash on the table to cover both drinks, even though I knew she'd brought her own card. As I stepped outside, the winter air hit my face, crisp and clean. Walking down Fifth, I realized something. This was the first time in years I'd been in a conversation with Sophie where I didn't feel like I was shrinking to fit into her frame. I'd stayed my size, my shape, my pace. Half a block later, my phone buzzed. It was an email notification, not from family, but from Ramon in Antigua. The subject line read, "Final phase complete." I stopped on the sidewalk, opened it. Photos of the completed facility filled the screen. Loading bays painted, signage up, staff lined up for a group shot. The pride on their faces was unmistakable. That was my narrative. Not the whispers, not the speculation. This. Work done well. People paid fairly. Something built to last. I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket and kept walking. The city's noise rising around me. Behind me. The cafe door swung open and closed again, but I didn't look back. Some conversations don't need follow-up. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be lived. 2 weeks passed before I heard from Sophie again. This time it wasn't a text or a voicemail loaded with urgency. It was a card, heavy cardstock, embossed with gold edges. Inside, in her looping, perfect handwriting, she wrote, "Liam and I are moving the wedding date up. We'd like you to be there. No apology. No mention of the cafe on 5th, just an invitation, like the last conversation hadn't happened at all." I set it on my desk beside the small glass paperweight I'd picked up in Antigua, a swirl of blues and greens, like the sea compressed into your palm. For a long moment, I stared at the card, thinking about the hundreds of times I'd been drawn back into that family loop, an insult, a confrontation, a temporary truce, then the cycle starting again. This time, I didn't feel the pull. Instead, I picked up my pen and wrote a single line on the back of the card. "Thank you for the invitation. I won't be able to attend. No explanations, no excuses, just the truth." I mailed it the same day. The next morning, my phone lit up with a call from my mother. I let it ring. She called again, and again. Then Sophie's name appeared on the screen. I turned the phone face down and went back to reviewing a logistics proposal from our Singapore partners. By Friday, the noise had died down. Whatever storm my absence was causing, they'd turned it inward, passing the frustration back and forth until it settled into the usual family hum. On Saturday, I was at the Antigua facility for the official opening. The air was hot, heavy with salt, and the ribbon-cutting scissors gleamed in the sun. Ramon gave a short speech, his voice breaking when he talked about the jobs this place would provide. I stood off to the side, hands clasped loosely, letting the moment belong to the team. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. This building is more than a hub. It's proof of what can happen when the right people work together, quietly, with purpose. Key. Applause rose around me, warm and unforced. In that moment, I thought about the dinner weeks ago, the smirks, the cheap shots, the way Sophie's fiancé had turned the whole table with one question about the jet. I could still hear the scraping of forks against plates, the sudden, stunned hush, and I realized something. That moment had been for them. This one was for me. After the ceremony, I walked along the edge of the docks, watching the sun burn down toward the horizon. A few cargo containers bore the Archer insignia. Familiar, but no longer a badge. I felt the need to hide or explain. A gull wheeled overhead, its cry sharp against the steady thrum of engines. I thought of Sophie's card, of the polite refusal I'd sent. I thought of the cafe, the way she'd looked at me like she didn't recognize what she was seeing. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she never would. That was okay. Because the point of all this, the work, the distance, the silence, was never to make them understand. It was to make sure I did. By the time I returned to Seattle, the wedding had come and gone. I saw a few photos online, Sophie in white lace, Liam beaming. My parents posed on either side of them. There was no mention of me in the captions, no seat left empty at the reception. I closed the browser and went back to work, late one night, weeks later. I got an email from Sophie. The subject line was blank, in the body. Just one sentence. "I hope you're happy." I read it twice, then 3 times, feeling for any hook beneath the words. There wasn't one. I typed a reply. I am. And for the first time in years, I meant it. The next morning, I walked down to the harbor before the city woke. The water was still, the early light scattering gold over its surface. I stood at the edge, hands in my coat pockets, breathing in the cold air. Behind me, the streets would fill soon, emails would pile up, meetings would happen, the rhythm of business would take over again. But here, now, it was quiet. No one was calling my name. No one was asking for a statement or a defense. It was the kind of quiet you don't earn by winning an argument or proving a point. You earn it by stepping away from the table altogether. I stayed until the sun cleared the horizon, then turned and walked back toward the city. Not to them, not to explain, just forward. Conclusion. In the end, there was no grand confrontation, no final dinner where I stood and delivered the perfect speech. There was only a choice, and I made it quietly. For years, I believed the only way to change how my family saw me was to work harder, achieve more, prove myself in a way so undeniable they'd have no choice but to respect it. But here's the truth I had to learn the long way. People who've already decided your worth will bend any reality to fit their judgment. At that family dinner, when the question about the jet turned the air cold and every gaze locked on me, I could have listed every hour, every risk, every deal that got me there. But explaining myself would have been an invitation for them to debate my own life. So I let the silence answer for me. Weeks later, when Sophie's wedding came and went without me, I felt no sting of exclusion. I'd been excluded in spirit long before I was absent in body. Declining that invitation wasn't revenge. It was release. Standing on that dock in Antigua, watching the facility open, I saw the real measure of my life. It wasn't in the labels my family tried to stick on me, or the ones they withheld out of spite. It was in the people I'd chosen to stand beside, the work we'd built, the lives changed because of it. Walking away didn't mean I lost. It meant I stopped playing a game I never agreed to in the first place. If there's a lesson in all this, it's not about jets or bank accounts. It's about boundaries, about understanding that you don't owe anyone your story, your proof, or your presence, especially not those who've made it clear they'll use it to diminish you. You can build your life in full view of the world, or you can build it in quiet and let the results speak. I chose the latter. And here's the irony my family will never admit. The moment I stopped trying to make them see me was the moment I became impossible to ignore. I'm Aubrey Archer, and I no longer measure myself by the size of their table or whether they save me a seat. I have my own table now, and it's exactly the right size.